So it's lovely to be here today with Professor Margaret Kelleher and to talk about the wonderful success of your book. First of all, Margaret, your not just success with the research of it, but also the huge success that the book has had since it was published, The Mam-Trasna Murders by Professor Margaret Kelleher. Margaret, would you tell us a little bit about what drew you to that story, that extraordinary story about what happened in Mam-Trasna following the events of 1882?
Absolutely, and thanks Deirdre for making the time to have the conversation. I suppose my interest in the book is twofold. One, a professional answer, and one, a personal one. The professional answer has to do with previous work I did in the Cambridge History of Irish Literature. I had the great honour of co-editing that with Philip O'Leary in Boston College. And we were very proud of the work we achieved there in relation to Irish literature in both languages. But the chapters in the distinct languages sat in distinct chapters. And one of the very, I think, legitimate comments about the work afterwards was that structure didn't allow much room for the interrelationship between the two language traditions. So I think for me, there was a sort of unfinished business about the relationship between traditions, and in particular, that issue of bilingual culture. And the second reason is a personal one. Like so many people, I pounced really on the census records when they became available just almost 10 years ago now. In fact, even more than 10 years ago, through the great work of Katrina Crowe and colleagues in the National Archives. And I discovered to my real surprise, Deirdre, that bilingualism had a much older history in my family than I had expected. My great-grandfather on my father's side and my great-grandmother were listed in the 1911 census as bilingual. They lived in North Cork and Dromahane outside Mallow. And I hadn't any sense that bilingualism had stayed in my family, until that period. Although my grandfather, who was 17 in 1911, was listed as English only. And then down the road, my future grandmother was listed as bilingual for very different reasons. She was studying Irish at school, so her parents entered her and her younger brother as scholars, that wonderful word in the census, and they were entered as speaking Irish and English, even though their parents, my great-grandparents, spoke English only. So for that reason, I became interested in, I suppose, what might be called, and I was delighted to discover it is called by sociolinguistics, the messier questions of language use in our history.
And I suppose one of the messy questions is the question around translation, or indeed the inability to translate or to be translated. And I think one of the really fascinating things that happens in the book is that aside from it telling the story of the Mam-Trasna murders and interrogating them very thoroughly, we move into a territory that's not unlike Brian Friel's translations, where people are trapped in this linguistic contour that's not of their own making. Can you tell us about the connection between what you've just described as your interest in language and bilingualism, and then how you moved to being interested in this way in which these people were trapped through no fault of their own by being monoglot Irish speakers, and eventually, of course, as the saga will unfold, we can talk about that, but how you were drawn to that first big question about being trapped in a linguistic contour, shall we say.
It's a very pertinent one, Deirdre, because originally I thought I was writing a history of bilingualism in 19th century Ireland. And I think it would have been a little like, is it Casaubon in Middlemarch, the key to all mythologies? I'd still be writing it. And I do think there's still an awful lot more work to be done, on the relationship between the languages and the persistence of bilingualism. As you say, that larger question, language change can seem inevitable to us looking back, but one of the points I'm trying to make in the book is that cultural change never seems inevitable to those who are living through it. So really what led me, with the advice of good friends as well, to focus in on the more specific question of Mam-Trasna, which I had originally been thinking of as a chapter in the unfinishable book. What led me to focus in on that is the opportunity really through the case of Mam-Trasna to get a sort of snapshot in time. And as I say a number of times in the book, who spoke what language mattered greatly in the case of the Mam Trasna. Who were bilingual, who were monolingual, had in fact fatal consequences for those who were monolingual.
So for our listeners, Margaret, could you tell us a little bit about the actual story itself? I know it has gathered its own momentum and mythology around it, and it's wonderful to have it unraveled for us and reconstructed. Tell us about the narrative and the events that led up to the 17th of August, 1882.
That's right. On the evening of the 17th of August, 5 members of the Joyce family were brutally murdered in their home in Mam Trasna, a townland on the borders of Galway and Mayo, indeed in the famous Joyce country. And the details of the murders were very shocking and immediately made not just local press or national press, but also international press. As I said, 5 members of the family were brutally murdered. John Joyce and his wife, Bridget, who was his second wife and stepmother to his children. 2 of his children were brutally murdered, his teenage son, Michael, and his teenage daughter, Peggy. And then the 5th victim that evening was John's elderly mother, Margaret, whom we estimate to have been in her early 80s. 1 child survived that night, the child Patsy, who was, we think, 7 years of age and who was injured badly but survived that evening. And then the other member of the family who survived, Martin, was out of the house that evening, working with a local neighbour. And so I think it's the brutality, Deirdre, of the violence that caught the attention. The women were bludgeoned to death. Shots were used for the men, or I suppose I should say really the man and teenage boy, but the women were bludgeoned to death. And the second aspect that made the story infamous very quickly was that the accused were local neighbours. This was the time, 1882, of land agitation. Readers in Ireland and outside of Ireland would have been more familiar of cases of agrarian violence directed against land agents or landlords. But this was, I suppose, in a word of our own time, considered to be internecine violence, that it was members of community brutally killing others.
The brutality of it is something which you as a writer have to approach. We can't shirk away from the brutality. And the brutality includes the fact that John Joyce's body is lying naked on the ground, and that dogs have chewed at the corpse of his mother. I mean, it's violent, it's vicious, it's highly dramatic, it's highly visual. The descriptions of the scene begin to take their own momentum in the public press, and there is almost, I think, maybe a prurience about it. And I was very interested, and you quote from a number of the newspaper commentaries on it. You quote the Spectator magazine on the 18th of November in 1882, where the description of the event becomes conflated with an understanding of what the Irish natives are like. The idea that they are savage, more savage than any other white men, I'm just looking at it here, that they are more like the Maoris or other Polynesians. So to some degree, the event becomes conflated with other issues around race and racial tension. How did you unpack that, or how did you approach that?
It was difficult, and I sometimes think, looking back on the book, Deirdre, that I was trying to read between the lines, or sometimes even against the lines. And the example you've chosen is a fantastic one of a source that not alone doesn't tell us anything, it's actually counterproductive as a source, because it situates, the victims in, as you say, a very racialized and really unsympathetic discourse. I did find there were some exceptions, and sometimes the local media and even sometimes the national media, almost despite itself, gave me more information. I'm a literature scholar. One of the things we're trained to do is to be close readers. So really my methodology in the book in many cases was to do a close reading between the lines and under the lines of historical sources. There's one passage, in fact, that would complement the one from The Spectator that you mentioned, which I think would work nicely. Perhaps I might read from it for a few moments. Would that be okay?
That's wonderful.
It's an extract from the Freeman's Journal. The Freeman's Journal, the national paper based in Dublin, sent a number of reporters to the scene, and the journey indeed was a difficult one, and I talk about that in the book. But one of the reporters describes the murder scene in the days that follow, and the quotation begins, "Groups of peasantry sat on the hillside above the house where the dead and wounded were lying. They had an ample supply of pipes and tobacco for the wake, and the women cried bitterly. The police were moving about or sitting lazily on the wall, save those who were in attendance on the poor wounded boy, Patrick. No one could be got to assist in attending him or nursing him, although Mr. Brady, the resident magistrate, on his arrival on Friday, appealed to the women who were then, as on Saturday, gathered in large numbers on the hillside to give their assistance in nursing the unfortunate lad. He offered any reasonable sum as remuneration, but no one would volunteer for the duty."
This local response is very curious, and I suppose it sets in train a lot of speculation about who is involved or who might have been involved in the actual murders. And as we've said, nobody would enter the house for fear, and a whole sort of confusion then emerges as the coroner's inquest is about to begin. There is a kind of gendered response, and I wondered myself in reading the book about even the gendered ways in which the deaths took place. Is there anything in that or any understanding of why that was the case?
I think that's a key question. Obviously, in the passage I just read, even the journalist is really aghast at the spectacle of the local women refusing to tend to the injured boy. And it suggests, and again, I think a core element in this is a community breakdown, a breakdown of the most basic kind of patterns of affiliation, of loyalty, of affection. But it's striking that as a reader you picked up on that, Deirdre, because I think one of the cases, a few cases of folklore that we have in the wonderful National Folklore Commission of University College Dublin actually circles back again on that, almost like a knot that later people are trying to unravel. And the piece of folklore comes from the 1940s. It's given by a man who was born Mortino Duha, who was born a couple of years after the case. But in it, he relays a local story. And the story, I suppose, just to tell it quickly, goes as follows. That the story that was passed on was that the local men had gone to threaten John Joyce, that he was considered to have caused offence in the community, that the events got out of hand and that they killed him. And as they were leaving the house, the elderly woman reputedly said to her daughter-in-law, "Did you recognize them?" The younger woman said, "I did." And the men went back and killed the women. And I think it's, in many ways, it's a very ugly story. It's horrible to even kind of relay it. But I think it's very striking that that's the story that's passed on among some people in the community, that it's a way of almost trying to, I suppose, come to terms with, and even problematically to try and justify, or at the very least to try and explain the violence against the women.
And then there is the explaining, which you do so eloquently, of what happens next. As you say, we have a book that contains a salutary example of an Irish-speaking man wrongly convicted of a murder in an English-speaking court. Can you tell us about the start of the inquest, the investigations, and the problem about accurate translation?
Very quickly, in the days that followed, men were arrested, and eventually 10 men were formally accused. and were brought first to Galway and then eventually for trial in Dublin, which is a striking part of the case. It was felt that they couldn't receive a fair trial in Galway, and under the special commission at the time for land agitation, they were treated as a special case and brought to Dublin, which is, I suppose, layered in irony, Deirdre, given the injustices that would emerge in the trial that followed. A complication also had to do with the prosecution witnesses. Initially, three key prosecution witnesses were first cousins of the murdered man, John Joyce, but they were also first cousins of a number of the accused, most famously now, decades later, Miles Joyce. So Miles Joyce, two of his brothers, a nephew of his, and 6 other men were formally charged. Then, and a key issue coming back to what we were talking about just a few moments ago in language, 2 of the men turned Queen's evidence, Thomas Casey and Anthony Philbin. And one of the really striking details from my research there is both those men were bilingual. They had spent significant periods of time in England, and they were back and forth to England as migrant labourers. So they had a linguistic competence that many of the other accused didn't have, which of course was to communicate directly with the prosecution counsel in English, and they turned Queen's evidence, and indeed in very large part mendacious evidence, which supported the Crown's case. And so that issue of language, who had access to English, was already there in the background, but it would be made most problematically visible in the court, where, and this, I suppose, is a complex issue. I discovered that in some of the accounts of the case beforehand, and this is, of course, a well-known case that has been written about in the past, there's sometimes a simplification that an interpreter wasn't available. In many ways, it's almost worse. There was an interpreter present in the courtroom. By now, we moved to November 1882 in Dublin. A man called Constable Evans, who was a member of the RIC employed in the west of Ireland. And he was available to, of course, translate the evidence of the prosecution witnesses, the Joyces, who were monoglot speakers. But in a fateful and indeed fatal turn of events, it was believed that Miles Joyce, a key accused, could understand English. And the services of the translator weren't made available to him. For me, actually, one of the most incredible moments is it would appear that his defence counsel wasn't aware that Miles Joyce couldn't understand English. It's quite incredible. So the services of the translator that could have been available were suspended, and in fact were only made available to him when the time of the verdict came, and when the judge, and it's clear from contemporary journalism and indeed the court transcript, that the judge then realised that Miles Joyce wasn't aware of what the verdict meant. This is a man who had protested his innocence from the beginning. The 2 accused men who had been tried before him would later attest to his innocence also, although they acknowledged that they were part of the murder party. So we have, to my mind, incontestable evidence of Miles Joyce's innocence, and yet he was not able, to hear much of the proceedings conducted against him.
And if I remember correctly, Margaret, the jury that was sworn in, the jury of 18, some of those did not speak English and had very limited understanding even of what was going on as a jury. Was that the case?
That's right. In the very first jury, there were a number of trials. The jury that was held in the coroner's inquest and the first jury in Cong. By the time we moved to Dublin, to the November trial, we're in really an Anglophone world where the problem, in fact, is the opposite one, that most of the jurors, wouldn't have understood the Irish evidence, and the translator then was needed for them. It's one of the things, Deirdre, I think I probably find the most shocking and this is again where would really welcome further research, you know, for your students in education, for mine in cultural history, is it really seems to me by 1882 there was a sort of cultural chasm in the country. And because, you know, the fact that Miles Joyce, I was able to estimate from the census, the 1881 census had shown that in the barony of Ross, where Miles Joyce lived, 90% of the population spoke Irish, and half of those, about 45%, spoke Irish only. So absolutely, as you say, in the very first trial, a number of the jurors there would have had limited, if any, comprehension of English. And then when we moved to Green Street Courthouse in Dublin, the same country, 2 months later, very little Irish, you know, would have been understood by those in attendance, by the jurors, and I suppose most importantly, by the legal counsel.
And in addition to all of this, and you have a whole web of lies and confusion that nearly derails the whole process then, to what degree did you believe or find that the whole climate of unrest generally around the land wars and the Phoenix Park stabbing, for example, to what degree was there a baying for blood, that there had to be a resolution?
I've heard the wonderful historian Garrodo Toohey make that point. You know, his argument is that there was really a brutalization of politics, really, and in that time, I suppose, fueled by exactly the Phoenix Park murders, and then a whole kind of climate of violence. And the jury, for example, in the case of Miles Joyce, retired for 6 minutes. You know, his fate really was assured long before and the court case happened. And as our colleague Niamh Howland showed, Niamh from the School of Law in UCD, you know, the verdict was unsafe, even according to the practice of the time, because for the posthumous pardon that was given to Miles Joyce, which in a way is one of the endings of my book, you know, from verdict to execution to posthumous, very belated pardon, one of the grounds for that posthumous pardon had to be that the conviction was unsafe, not just according to the standards of our time, but unsafe according to the standards of that time. And there's a sense, and you know, don't have time to go into it in detail here, but there's a sense, and I give the passages in the book where it really seems to me that in the courtroom that day in November 1882, people could see that Miles Joyce was guilty. There's a comment in the Daily Express newspaper that his reaction to the verdict caused a remarkable impression on the court. And that's a very troubling thing, isn't it? That there would have been a sense even then that injustice had been practiced.
And even Patrick Casey and Patrick Joyce themselves said that Miles was innocent. Even as they accept their own death sentence, they say he is innocent, but he doesn't speak or understand English, and he's grossly represented in court, as you've explained. And then there is his own reaction to the verdict. You might read to us a little from the book on that, because the accounts of the reaction to the verdict, they're very poignant, and they really sit at the core of the injustice that we see happening in the trial and in the arrival at this verdict.
I'd be very happy to, and in fact, the example I would choose is from the Freeman's Journal, partly because it relates to something we talked about at the beginning of our conversation here, you know, about reading between the lines, because although this is translated, indeed, there are layers of translation here. This is from a journalist who is reproducing the act of the court translator, and then it's being translated to us all those decades later. But I think even in the Hiberno English, we can hear even cadences and traces of the original Irish. The interpreter, Constable Evans, was called by direction of the learned judge, and he communicated to the prisoner in Irish the fact that he had been found guilty. A change then came upon the prisoner. He showed a little fear and clutched the bar of the dock, but looking upwards with a fervent expression and attitude of invocation, spoke in Irish. The interpreter rendered it as follows: "He leaves it to God and the Virgin above his head. He had no dealing with it, no more than the person who was never born, nor had he against anyone else. For the last 20 years he had done no harm, and if he had, might he never go to heaven. He was as clear of this as the child yet to be born. He slept in his bed with his wife that night, and he had no knowledge about it whatever. He is quite content with whatever the gentleman may do to him, but whether he is to be hung or crucified, he is as free as he can be." You know, all these years later, I actually still gulp reading that. And the, of course, again, there's the striking factor that the interpreter has changed the pronouns. You know, that would be considered bad practice now in court practice today. You know, that the requirement of a court interpreter is to do direct translation. I leave it to God and the Virgin. So even by changing the pronouns, you can see that the interpreter was already positioned, you know, with the side of the court. But the simplicity of, to maybe translate it backwards, "I slept in my bed with my wife that night," you know, just has a power, doesn't it, even all those years later?
Absolutely. And I suppose a final cruelty is, in fact, the execution of Miles Joyce himself, which doesn't go as smoothly as an execution should go. It's another sort of torture in the whole unfolding. The executioner came from England. Tell us about your research on that, the skill of the executioner, and what actually happens.
And, you know, just pause for a moment. The light has changed in my room here, and I think it changed as I was reading from Miles Joyce. So, yeah. Gosh, it's kind of uncanny in our the setting of our conversation. Yeah, the details of the execution also became infamous, as Marwood, the executioner, coming from England. And then because Miles Joyce protested to the last, the rope slipped, and this is again one of the really gruesome details, and Miles Joyce died of strangulation rather than a broken neck, which is, however, also barbaric, you know, is intended to be kind of the legal form of capital murder, I suppose. And that detail of a man protesting to the last, again, I think really entered popular memory about the case, and really was passed on in the locality. There are ballads at the time that really, where Marwood again is this diabolical figure. There are stories in Galway of a belief that the ghost of Miles Joyce appeared, you know, to men in the jail, or that the governor of the jail went mad. But I suppose all at the root of that is that just horrific scene of violence where Miles Joyce, because he was protesting his innocence, you know, suffered a particularly gruesome death.
And the violence of the murders, the violence of his death, they're central to the book, and they're the majority of the book. But there is also what you're at pains to discuss it towards the end of the book, which is the violence of the state, not just in the contemporaneous context, but in a wider context. And you remind your readers that this violence has not been consigned to history. Tell us why you wanted to also unpack that at the end of the book and talk about the injustices, as you've said, from a state's failure to recognize languages other than those that are officially sanctioned.
I'm really glad you've asked me about that, because I really made really what I consider an ethical decision then when I speak about the case, and obviously in terms of writing the book, that I would finish with that. And in a way, what I'm looking at is the descendants of Miles Joyce. And I know the real life descendants, wonderful people like Caroline Connaboy and her sister Alice, who've become friends of mine over the years. But I'm also interested in the symbolic descendants, as you say, in terms of today. Just one statistic I came across only recently is a recent report by the Immigrant Council in Ireland showed that 79% of recent immigrants to Ireland who'd been interviewed for the report had acted as informal interpreters or translators for family and friends, and that in Ireland today, we've very problematic cases of children and being required to act as translators for their parents, in the cases of welfare, medical situations, legal situations. And I suppose what that is pointing to, and an issue that is so, as you know better than most, Deirdre, is such a strong educational issue as well, is that we live in Ireland in a multilingual society, a country that was bilingual not that long ago and is now gloriously multilingual. Maybe we'll be able to see kind of the monoglot nature of Irish society as actually a very small period in our history, when we look to the future. But it does mean that there is such a danger of injustices. I know Amnesty International Ireland are increasingly concerned about poor standards of court interpreting, and there's an awful sense of almost a miscarriage of justice waiting to happen for that reason. So, as you say in the end of the book, I finish with a comment really about migration and mobility, that in a time now where people are moving, where people have what we might call jagged trajectories around language, where people have maybe bits and pieces of languages and find themselves in countries where they're not able to take part in official business in the language of the state. We have, I think, that very dangerous clash between linguistic diversity among people and the monoglot nature of most states. So at the end of the book, I'm trying to locate really the case of Miles Joyce and that prisoner at the bar, with the situation of other people at the bar and the language crossings that are happening in our own time.
The case of Miles Joyce, as you mentioned just a little while ago, the government commissioned an expert review of the case. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the expert review undertaken by Dr. Niamh Howlin and how it was usable with other forms of material in your research?
It was the result of great labours by many people, by Sean O'Carron, who's written very powerfully himself about the Mamtrasna murders, by a man called Johnny Joyce. And it's lovely as we come to a close, I think, for me to particularly mention him. Johnny died not long ago, but he's a great grandson of John Joyce, the murdered man, which really, I suppose, brings us full circle, Deirdre. His grandfather, Martin Joyce, was the young man who was out of the house that night. And I always find Johnny's role in the case really inspiring, because as a descendant of the murdered victims, he campaigned tirelessly for a pardon for Miles Joyce and was convinced of his innocence. So a lot of great work done indeed by Maura Whelan, Enda Kenny and others, but it culminated in the request of a piece of research magnificently undertaken by Niamh Howlin, as you say, which then found that Miles Joyce's verdict was unsafe according to the standards of the time, and her findings are available online as an open document. That in turn led then to the granting of the posthumous pardon by the President, Michael D. Higgins. And there was a wonderful irony about that, Deirdre. I suppose a final image. We were gathered in Áras an Uachtaráin, which of course was the Viceregal Lodge. And that was the place where Spencer, the Lord Lieutenant, infamously sent a telegram when a request for clemency for Miles Joyce had been sent prior to the execution. He infamously sent a telegram saying the law must take its course. And it really was uncanny to be gathered in Áras an Uachtaráin on that same site, marking the pardon for Miles Joyce. And maybe one last reference to language on that. I sometimes think that the word mahunas is preferable to pardon, because of course there is that issue of, can one be pardoned for what one hasn't done? And mahunas has at least one meaning of remittance, but maham, to make good. So all those decades later, there was at least a partial making good of the conviction.
Thank you very much for discussing the book with us, Margaret. It has reached a huge audience and captured the imaginations of many readers, and I'm sure will continue to do so as it goes into further editions. So I'd like to congratulate you as a fellow UCD woman on your wonderful achievement in the Mam Drasna murders, and thank you for talking about it with us on this podcast today.
And Deirdre, could I finish by thanking UCD Press? I particularly want to thank them for just how handsome the publication is, and all their work indeed between the lines here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.